was crouching behind a blast barrier in Kandahar when my phone buzzed. Not the secure line. My personal cell, the one I only kept charged, for two reasons, my daughter and my wife. It was my daughter. I almost didn't answer. We were 12 minutes from a coordinated entry on a compound that had been months in the making. My team lead, Sergeant Major Dawson, was 3 feet to my left running final comms checks. The kind of moment where a distraction gets people killed. But something made me pick up. Dad, her voice was wrong. Not scared, wrong. Hollow wrong. Like she'd already used up all her fear and what was left was just emptiness. Something happened to Mom. I pressed the phone harder against my ear. Where are you right now? The hospital. St. Catherine's. Dad, they're saying she was drunk. She wasn't drunk. I picked her up from book club. She had 1 glass of wine. I was with her, and then... She stopped. I could hear her trying to breathe. These cops pulled us over on Route 9 near the overpass, and they made me sit in the patrol car and I couldn't see what was happening. And then, Jenna. My voice came out quieter than I intended. Is your mom conscious? Silence. Jenna. She's in surgery. I stood up from behind that barrier and walked away from the operation. Dawson called after me. I didn't turn around. My name is Kurt Merritt. I'm 32 years old. For the past 9 years, I've been a Special Forces Weapons Sergeant with the 7th Group out of Fort Bragg. Now Fort Liberty, if you want to use the new name, which I don't. 3 deployments to Afghanistan, 1 to Mali. A TDY rotation to Colombia that I'm still not allowed to talk about in detail. I've seen the kinds of things that change how you understand the world. My wife Sylvie was, before that night, the kind of woman who brings food to her neighbor's door when she hears someone's been sick. She teaches 4th grade. She coaches the girls' softball team on Saturdays. She is, without question, the most decent person I have ever known. Our daughter Jenna was 17 that fall. Sharp kid. Wanted to study environmental science at UNC. She had her mom's patience and, God help her, my stubbornness. We lived in Terryfield, North Carolina. Small enough that everyone knew your name. Big enough to have its politics. The police department had 11 officers. The chief had held the position for 19 years. His name was Chief Warren Spade. I'd heard the name in passing. Never had reason to think about it. I had a lot of reason to think about it after that night. Getting emergency leave when you're deployed isn't quick, and every hour waiting felt like swallowing gravel. Dawson helped cut through some of the paper. I was on a flight out of Bagram, 18 hours after Jenna's call, connecting through Frankfurt, landing in Charlotte at 6:47 in the morning, 2 days after my wife had been admitted to St. Catherine's Regional Medical Center. Jenna met me at the hospital entrance. She'd barely slept. I could tell because she looked exactly like I felt. I hugged her for a long time without saying anything. Then I went to see Sylvie. She was in the ICU on the 3rd floor. The attending physician, a tired-looking man named Dr. Prentice, walked me through it in the hallway before I went in. Orbital fracture around the left eye. 2 cracked ribs. Deep contusions along her left shoulder and upper arm, consistent with... And he paused here, looking at his clipboard. Blunt force contact with a hard surface. What kind of hard surface? I said. He looked at me carefully. The pattern is consistent with a baton or a boot, and the official police report says she was resisting arrest, intoxicated. That's what it says. Did anyone run a blood alcohol panel when she came in? Another pause. Longer this time. She was brought in as a trauma case. By the time a panel was run, it had been several hours. I looked at him. He looked back at me. We both understood what that meant. I thanked him and went inside. Sylvie was awake. Barely. The left side of her face was swollen in a way that made her almost unrecognizable. There were monitor leads on her chest and an IV in her right arm. When she saw me, her eye, the one that wasn't swollen shut, filled up immediately. She couldn't talk much. Her jaw was wired from a hairline fracture they'd found on the second X-ray. So I sat next to her and held her hand and let her squeeze it as hard as she needed to. And I talked to her quietly about nothing important for a while. And eventually she fell back asleep. I sat there in the dark for another hour. Then I went out into the hall and called a man named Reyes. Marcus Reyes and I had served together for 6 years before he transitioned out and went private security. He now ran a small consulting firm out of Fayetteville that did, let's say, a variety of things for clients who needed problems assessed. He was the best surveillance tech I'd ever worked with. He could pull information from sources that technically shouldn't exist, and he did it without leaving fingerprints. I need everything you can find on a Terryfield PD, I told him. Chief named Warren Spade. 3 officers who were on patrol the night of November 14th on Route 9, and I need it without any flags going up. "Give me 48 hours," he said. "You've got 24. He called back in 19. What he'd found was not a surprise, exactly. It was more like confirmation of something I'd already started to feel in my chest, that particular cold weight that settles in when you realize the situation is worse than you hoped. Warren Spade had been chief since before the previous mayor took office. In that time, 6 successive force complaints had been filed against officers under his command. None had resulted in termination. 2 of the complainants had later been charged with separate misdemeanors, charges that, to Reyes's eye, looked like they'd been manufactured. One complainant had moved out of Terryfield entirely within 3 months of filing. The 3 officers on duty that night on Route 9 were a sergeant named Burl Cotton, a patrol officer named Kevin Doss, and a 3rd officer named Ray Tilden. Cotton had 2 prior use-of-force incidents on his record, both cleared internally. Reyes also found something else. Sylvie's brother, a man named Philip, had been in a long-running dispute with the city over a piece of commercial property on the east side of town. The property sat adjacent to a development project that several of Terryfield's city council members had financial stakes in, including one councilman who golfed regularly with Chief Spade. The stop on Route 9 hadn't been random. Sylvie had been specifically targeted. A message to her brother to drop the property dispute. I sat with that information for about 4 minutes. Then I called Reyes back and told him I needed 2 more things: a full layout of the Terryfield PD building and the personal address of Sergeant Burl Cotton. Here is where I want to be careful about what I say. Not for my sake. I've made my peace with the decisions I made in that window of time. But there are people I care about whose lives could still be complicated by specifics. What I will say is this: I did not go to the Terryfield Police Department to file a complaint. I had read the file. I knew what happened to complaints. I did not go to the media first. I had assets, and I had a window. And I understood that, once this became public, the window would close. I called 4 people. Men I had served with, men who understood operational discipline, who knew how to move without being seen, and who I trusted the way you can only trust someone you've been in a burning building with. They drove in from 3 different states. We met at a motel outside of town that had no cameras in the parking lot. We planned for 2 days. Jenna stayed with my mother-in-law during this time. I told her I was handling things. She looked at me the way teenagers look at you when they know you're not telling them everything but they trust you enough to let it go. "Is Mom going to be okay?" she asked me the night before. "Yes," I said. "She is." "Are the people who did this going to be okay?" I looked at my daughter for a moment. "They're going to be held accountable," I said. "That's what matters." She nodded slowly. She was her mother's daughter. She accepted that answer. We started with documentation. Before anything else, documentation. Reyes had a contact, former military, now a paralegal in Asheville, who helped us file a federal civil rights complaint with the DOJ field office in Charlotte. We did this quietly, through channels that weren't connected to Terryfield. We collected Jenna's eyewitness account in a formal written statement. We obtained the dashcam footage through a third-party records request, filed by Reyes's contact using a shell LLC that had no obvious connection to us, before anyone had reason to flag the request or lose the footage. The footage was bad. I mean that in the clearest possible way. Sergeant Cotton's dashcam showed Sylvie's car, showed the stop, showed her getting out of the vehicle compliant and calm. What happened after she was moved to the far side of the patrol car, out of direct dashcam frame, wasn't captured, but the audio was. I'm not going to describe what was on that audio in detail. I've heard things in my career that most people will never hear. That audio was in the top 5 worst things I've ever listened to. We made 8 copies and stored them in 8 separate locations. Then we moved on to the next piece. Philip, my brother-in-law, didn't know what Sylvie had been through on his behalf. He found out when I sat down across from him at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and laid it all out. He's a quiet man. Methodical. Runs a small landscaping business. Coaches Little League in the summer, says grace before dinner. Not the type to be involved in anything that would make him a target. That was, I think, why he'd been chosen. He was supposed to be easy to intimidate. He wasn't easy to intimidate. But he was scared, and he had every right to be. I told him what I'd found: the property dispute, the council connection, Spade's relationship with Councilman Derek Foy. I told him that his sister had been hurt because of a real estate deal worth about $4 million to a group of men who were used to problems going away quietly. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. "What do you need from me?" he finally said. "I need you to hold on to the property," I said. "Don't sell, don't sign anything. Not yet. And I need copies of every document related to the dispute." He went to his filing cabin without another word and came back with a folder 3 inches thick. Officer Kevin Doss spoke first. That surprised me a little. I'd expected it to be Tilden, who struck me from Reyes's file as the least committed of the three. But Doss had a wife and a 2-year-old at home, and when someone left a manila envelope in his mailbox containing a printed summary of the DOJ complaint, a copy of the audio transcript from the dash cam, and a handwritten note that said simply, "They know what you did. You have a choice." He called the Terryfield PD non-emergency line within an hour and asked to speak to someone in internal affairs. There was no internal affairs unit in Terryfield. There were 11 officers and a chief. Doss instead called his personal attorney. His attorney, it turned out, had a professional relationship with a former state AG investigator now in private practice in Raleigh. That investigator, once he saw the materials, made 2 phone calls. One to the State Bureau of Investigation, and one to a contact he had at the Charlotte field office of the FBI. This is the part where things moved faster than I expected. The SBI opened a preliminary inquiry within 72 hours. A federal prosecutor made contact with Doss's attorney 6 days after that. By the time Cotton and Tilden realized what was happening, Doss was already in a conference room in Raleigh with 2 federal agents and a deal on the table. I won't pretend I engineered all of that. I set the first domino moving. What happened after had its own gravity. Chief Warren Spade was arrested on a Tuesday morning in February. 3 charges: civil rights violation under color of law, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit extortion. Cotton was arrested the same day. Tilden took a plea the week before and testified for the prosecution. Councilman Derek Foy resigned from his seat before charges were filed. He reached a civil settlement, the terms of which are sealed, shortly after. The development project collapsed when 2 of its other financial backers quietly withdrew. Philip's property dispute was resolved in his favor by the county in March. He sold the parcel for a price that, while not what the development group had hoped to pay, was fair. He used part of the proceeds to help pay for Sylvie's medical expenses. Sylvie got the wires off in January. First thing she did when she could open her mouth fully was eat a bowl of chicken and dumplings that Jenna made from scratch. Second thing she did was cry, which I understand. Third thing she did was sit across from me at our kitchen table and look at me in the way she has. The way that means she already knows the answer, but she's going to ask anyway. "How much of what happened," she said carefully, "was you handling things legally?" I considered the question. "Everything that mattered was fully legal and fully documented," I said. "The federal case is solid. It'll hold." She kept looking at me. "Some of the methods I used to gather initial information existed in a gray area," I said. "Nothing that harmed anyone. Nothing that compromises the case." She was quiet for a moment. The envelope in Doss's mailbox. "Anonymous tip," I said. "Happens all the time." She let out a long, slow breath. "Kurt." "He had a choice and he made the right one," I said. "The system worked. Eventually, with a little help getting started." She looked out the window for a while. Then she looked back at me. "I want you to promise me something," she said. "When you came back and you were planning whatever it was you were planning, I know what you're capable of. I need to know that you didn't." "I didn't," I said. "I want them in a courtroom. I want it on record. I want it public. That's the only version of this that protects you and Jenna long term." She searched my face for a long time. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay." I reached across the table and took her hand. She let me hold it. Outside the kitchen window, the yard was bare and brown, waiting for spring. There are things I didn't say to Sylvie that night. Not because they were secret exactly. More because they were mine. I spent 9 years training for extreme situations. Every mission briefing, every rehearsal, every after-action review. It's all built on the assumption that you know who the enemy is and you have clear rules of engagement. You go in, you do the job, you come home. What I wasn't prepared for, what nobody trains you for, is standing in an ICU hallway while a doctor tells you that your wife's injuries are consistent with a baton and a boot, and the people responsible are the same people whose job it was to protect her, and the institution that's supposed to hold them accountable is controlled by the same people. The military gave me skills. It didn't give me a clear framework for that particular problem. What I landed on, eventually, was this. The goal wasn't revenge. The goal was that Warren Spade could never do this to another family. That Burl Cotton would stand in front of a federal judge. That there would be a record, a permanent public record, that said what was done to Sylvie on Route 9 was wrong, and that it was known and that it was punished. Revenge would have been easier. I will pretend otherwise. There were nights in that motel room, sitting across from Reyes and the others, when easier was very appealing. But Jenna is watching everything I do. She is 17, and she is figuring out who she wants to be. And what I want her to see is that the man who raised her used his skills to get justice through every channel available to him. And when those channels were slow and broken, he helped clear the obstruction, and then he let the process do its job. That's the version of this I can live with. That's the version of this I can look her in the eye about. Spade's trial is scheduled for late spring. The federal prosecutor's office has been in contact with us about victim testimony. Sylvie is going to testify. She decided that before I had a chance to even raise the subject, I want to be in that room, she told me. I want him to see me standing up. Cotton took a plea in exchange for testimony against Spade. He'll do time regardless. Das cooperated fully and will likely avoid prison, a result that I have complicated feelings about, but which I've accepted because without his cooperation the case against Spade would be thinner. Tilden is no longer a law enforcement officer anywhere in North Carolina. That's something. Jenna got into UNC's environmental science program. Early decision. She called me when she found out, and I could hear in her voice that she'd been holding her breath for months without realizing it. And now she could finally breathe again. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of the commissary at Fort Liberty and did something I hadn't done in a long time. I let myself just feel relieved. Not victorious. Not justified. Not vindicated. Just relieved. The way you feel after a long operation when everyone makes it home, and you finally get to take the body armor off. Sylvie starts physical therapy next month for her shoulder. The orbital fracture healed cleanly. She's back in her classroom, back on the softball field on Saturdays. Her students made her a card when she came back that said, "We missed you." Mrs. Merritt, in about 15 different colors of marker. She keeps it on her desk. I've been asked by a few people since this started, people who knew what I did, who understood what I was capable of, whether I regret not doing more, whether I regret pulling back and letting the system work. I think what they're really asking is whether I'm disappointed that I didn't handle it the other way. My answer is no. And not because of some principle on performing for the audience. Because of something more practical. The men who hurt Sylvie were counting on the fact that their version of events was the only version anyone would ever hear. They were counting on the complaint going nowhere, on the footage disappearing, on Philip backing off the property deal, on me being 12,000 miles away and helpless. The best thing I could do, the thing that hurt them most, the thing they were least prepared for, was to be meticulous, to be patient, to document everything and build a case that couldn't be dismantled. That's what I trained for, really. Not violence. Violence is easy. Violence is fast and hot, and it burns itself out. What I trained for is staying functional under pressure, executing under conditions that would make most people fall apart, following the objective even when every instinct is screaming at you to do something else. The objective was a federal indictment, and we got it. Last week, I drove out to Route 9 just to look at it. It's a 2-lane road, nothing particular about it, the kind of road that's everywhere in this part of Carolina. Pine trees on both sides, a guardrail along one stretch where the shoulder drops off. Ordinary. I sat there in my truck for about 10 minutes and I tried to picture it. Sylvie's car, the flashing lights, Jenna being separated out, what the next 40 minutes looked like. Then I drove back home. Sylvie had dinner ready. Jenna was at the table doing homework, something about soil erosion and watershed management, and she complained cheerfully about the length of the reading, and I told her she chose this, and she said she knew. But she was still allowed to complain, and Sylvie laughed from the kitchen. That specific sound of my wife laughing in the next room, I held on to it. That's what it was all for. That's the only thing that was ever going to be enough. People ask me sometimes if I think about what would have happened if I'd taken the other road, the faster road. I know what they're really asking, and I don't blame them for asking it. When someone puts their hands on your wife and your daughter is screaming in the back of a patrol car, and you're 9 years into a career that trained you specifically for situations where the threat needs to be neutralized, the other road has a certain appeal. I won't pretend it didn't, but here's what I've come to understand about that road, and it took me sitting in a motel room outside Terryfield for 2 days to get there. The men who hurt Sylvie were counting on a specific reaction from me. They were counting on me being far away and helpless, or, if I came home, on me doing something that would make me the problem. That's how it works for people like Spade. They provoke the response that discredits the victim. A husband who shows up and does something reckless isn't a grieving man seeking justice. He becomes the story. The threat. The one they write the report about. The smartest thing I ever did was deny them that. What I've learned. Not in the military, not in any briefing room, but in the specific way that life teaches you things when the stakes are personal, is that discipline under pressure is not about suppressing what you feel. I felt everything. I felt it in that ICU hallway when Dr. Tyre Prentice was choosing his words carefully. I felt it when I listened to the dashcam audio for the first time. Discipline isn't the absence of emotion. It's choosing your objective and staying on it regardless of what emotion is doing to your internal temperature. The objective was accountability. Public, documented, permanent accountability. Not just for Sylvie, for every family Spade had quietly intimidated into backing down. Doss told investigators during his deposition that what happened on Route 9 wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the third. That's what men like Spade build when nobody pushes back hard enough. A system where they're the only ones who get to define what happened. I pushed back hard enough. Just not in the way they expected. There's something I want to say about Jenna, because I think about her role in this more than I've said out loud. She was 17 years old, sitting in the back of a patrol car, and she kept her head. She remembered details. She gave a statement that was coherent and specific and held up completely when it was compared to the audio record. I didn't teach her to do that. Sylvie did. 17 years of raising a kid who pays attention, who stays calm, who tells the truth even when it's hard. That's what made the difference in the first hours of this thing when the record was still being written. What I want Jenna to take from all of this, and I've told her some version of this, imperfectly in the way that fathers tell their kids things, is that intelligence without courage is just information. Courage without intelligence is just noise. What actually changes things is when you combine both and then have the patience to let the process work. That's the hardest part. The patience. Sitting still when every instinct says move. Warren Spade is going to stand in front of a federal judge. The record is going to say what happened on Route 9. Sylvie is going to be in that room, standing up, and he's going to have to look at her. That's the outcome. That's what the patience was for. And if I ever doubt it, if I ever sit with the version of events where I took the faster road and wonder, I just think about Sylvie laughing in the kitchen while Jenna complains about her homework. That sound. That specific, ordinary, irreplaceable sound. That's what discipline protects. Not principles, people.